A suspension of mercy. "21. The next morning's Times, Mondays, gave the carpet story 4 inches. Most of the item was devoted to a recapitulation of the circumstances of Alicia's disappearance. Her husband, Sidney Bartleby, 29, is an American and a freelance writer of fiction, the column concluded dryly, which gave Sidney the feeling the Times thought him also a freelance inventor of fiction in private life. Never mind, Sidney thought. The carpet might have been empty, but millions of people would fill that carpet in their imaginations because they wanted to fill it. For example, the readers of the Daily Express, who are often the same people as the readers of the Times. He went off in the car to Ronsin Old Tobacco and Candy Shop, which sold newspapers, to buy a Daily Express. The fat proprietor, who had the broadest Suffolk accent of any of the tradesmen, used not a syllable of it in his transaction with Sidney, only handed him his 2 pennies change from his 6pence with his lower lip firmly clamped over his upper. Mrs. Hawkins had already faithfully made her rounds, Sidney supposed, and reported Mrs. Lillybank's death. Back at home, Sidney seated himself on the sofa and perused the Daily Express write-up. The carpet story came out when Bartleby's next-door neighbour, Mrs. Grace Lillybanks, 73, at last told police what she had seen through her field glasses while bird-watching on the morning of July 3rd. If a wife is missing, it would seem unwise for a husband to bury anything, even a mothy carpet. Big Brother may be watching. Sidney sat down at his desk and went to work on his Paddington Snatchers synopsis. Plummer had had the 3rd finished script for 9 days, according to Alex's last note, and a synopsis of the 4th and 5th stories. Sidney felt Plummer might make up his mind before Alex finished his current script, and Sidney wanted to have as many ideas as possible to show if the whip was bought. And in America, Sidney's agent had had the planners for about a week, and it was probably at Simon & Schuster's by now. News on that any day now, too, because Sidney had asked his agent to inform him of a rejection as well as an acceptance. He finished his synopsis and began to break it down in scenes. His breakdown, he thought, couldn't have been better if Alex had been with him. When he finished it at 3, he put a new sheet of paper in the typewriter and wrote, Act 1, followed by a list of characters and sets. Then, Scene 1, a scrofulous exterior of Paddington Rachmanite dwellings. A series of innocent, everyday incidents. A woman shouts a message from a window to a small boy going off for a pitcher of beer from the local, exchanges gossip with a neighbour also leaning out the window. An old man tries to entice a cruising prostitute upstairs. Prostitute refuses to climb stairs. Cut, finally, to Greeno, the 16-year-old member of Paddington Terrors who leans like the others from a window, but gives a message of sinister import. A robbery was being planned. Within seconds of script time, the Terrors struck in the heart of W1, using a stolen Rolls-Royce for their approach and getaway. Sidney was on scene 2 and banging away merrily when a knock came at the door. The laundry, he thought at once, and he hadn't stripped the bed. Inspector Brockway stood at the door. "Afternoon, Mr. Bartleby. Sorry not to have rung first, but I was on the road and didn't pass a call box. Can you spare a moment?" "Yes, of course," Sidney said, opening the door wider. "Dr. Thwaite refused to give a certificate of natural death for Mrs. Lillybanks last evening," Brockway said. "I thought I should let you know." "What does that mean?" "That means there's got to be a post-mortem and an inquest. It means that Dr. Thwaite thinks Mrs. Lillybank's death might not have been due to entirely natural causes." "Oh. She died of a heart attack, from what I could see." "The doctor thinks you might have scared her. Inadvertently, perhaps, but what do you think?" Sidney knew what the inspector was driving at, and also knew the police probably hadn't finished looking for a body in the woods. The policemen were probably digging this minute, because Mrs. Lillybank's death had made a body in the woods more likely. "I could have, of course, but I knocked on the door, then called her name as I came in." The inspector drew up a straight chair. What exactly were you going to tell her? That there was nothing in the carpet, and that I didn't mind that she'd told you about it. I told you that last night. Yes. The inspector looked Sidney up and down quickly and seemed to be pondering his honesty. Sidney took a seat on the sofa. Well, the weeks go by, and your wife doesn't communicate. Sidney wiped his forehead nervously. I'm beginning to think she's with someone, a man, and doesn't want to admit it. She'd have to admit it if she came forth now. Or had you rather believe that now? The inspector asked in a kindly tone. I don't know what she's doing for money unless she's with someone, or working under another name, but I don't think that's likely. I had a look through the binoculars from Mrs. Lilybank's window also, said the inspector, at dusk one evening. It might be possible to make a mistake about what was in a large carpet. Something or nothing. Well, what did Mrs. Lilybanks say she saw? Oh, if she'd said she saw anything, I'd have told you, said the inspector, showing his teeth briefly. She said later she supposed something could have been in the carpet, but she was that kind of woman, you know, reluctant to tell me of the carpet in the first place. Consequently, very reluctant to tell me of any unpleasant doubts she may have had. Sidney was calm now, listening. You might have carried a body out in the carpet and buried the body somewhere else. I suppose that's possible, but not the same morning. As I said before, I'd have been too tired. 2 holes, you know. Inspector Brockway smiled patiently. Why do you say, I suppose that's possible? Your answers are strange. The story is possible, but not for me physically. Are they still digging in the woods? We're still digging, yes. I'm afraid, from the police point of view, that's the logical thing to do. We're still looking in Brighton and vicinity, of course. And maybe the logical thing for me to do is look in Brighton and vicinity too. If she's changed her hairdo, I think I'd be more likely to recognize her than anybody else. That is a point. Sidney felt disappointingly uninsulted by the inspector's attitude. He was reacting with impatience rather than guilt, and impatience was useless for his murderer's notes, he thought. Or was it? Would you have any objections if I went to Brighton for a few days? Not if you kept in touch with the police there. Give me a ring first. If I'm not in, I'll leave a message at Ipswich headquarters. By the way, we should have the result of the post-mortem tomorrow at 11, if you're interested. Sidney really wasn't, but he nodded politely. Thank you. Sidney went back to work after Brockway left. At 6:45, just before the newspaper shop closed at 7, he drove to Roncinol to see what the Evening Standard had to say about the digging. If they were still digging, the reporters should be interested, he thought. He was right. There was an article on page 4 with a large picture of a police officer in shirt sleeves digging in the woods, and an unflattering picture of the Bartleby house, so dim and drab it could easily be imagined the setting of a murder. The dustbin in the foreground was a particularly sordid touch. Much was made over the depth at which he had buried the carpet, as well as the fact the police were unsatisfied and still digging. The Daily Express would no doubt carry on tomorrow morning. Sidney thought it strange the Sneesums hadn't rung up about this, and then supposed they were leaving it entirely in the hands of the police. The telephone was ringing when he got home. The man's voice on the other end said that he represented the Daily Express, and could he come to see Sidney? He was ringing from a call box near Roncinol. Sorry, not this evening, and not tomorrow either. If you're innocent, sir, and I have no doubt you are, then a good newspaper story would help you. The Daily Express would like to be the first. I have nothing to say besides what I've told the police. The situation now doesn't look so comfortable for you, sir. I've spent the afternoon with the police in those woods. Then make up a story from what they told you. Have you any statement to make on the death of your neighbour, Mrs. Lilybanks, sir? Sidney put the telephone down. He was up early the next morning and went to the village for a Daily Express. This time, 3 early risers, 1 man and 2 women, stared at him in the shop as he waited to pay. The women edged away from him, but the man stood his ground boldly. Sidney knew them all only by sight, and perhaps he'd said good morning once or twice to all of them in the past, but there was no question of that now. Though one of the women smiled timidly, Sidney imagined her thinking with the others, "Murderer. The police are digging this minute for his wife's body. The grave digger of Ronsey Knoll." Once more the buttoned lip from the fat proprietor. Sidney had forgotten his change in a pair of trousers at home and had to break a 10-shilling note. A lad on the sidewalk, parking his bike, looked at Sidney with straightforward interest from under his tousled hair, however, and almost smiled. Sidney smiled at him, and then the boy smiled in return. He went home before he opened the paper. He found an item 5 inches long about Mrs. Lilybank's doctor refusing to sign a certificate of natural death because, "in the best of my opinion, she was in quite good health, even so far as her heart went, on Sunday, August 14th, and I see no reason for her to have dropped dead without some external cause." Sidney Bartleby, the item continued, her next-door neighbour, stated that he called on her Sunday evening for the purpose of informing her that the police had found nothing in the now famous buried carpet. Police authorities are still digging in the vicinity for a possible body, as Mrs. Alicia Bartleby has been missing since July 2nd. The 60-hour search of the woods has so far revealed nothing. Sidney spent the rest of the day and evening advancing his script of The Paddington Snatchers. On Wednesday, Sidney drove to Ipswich, deposited his car in a parking lot, got £20 from the bank, and took a train to London. He carried an overnight bag which actually belonged to Alicia, but was not too feminine for a man to carry. He thought he might be away 2 or 3 nights. In London he realised he hadn't rung Brockway, so he did this. The inspector was not available at the Ipswich station, but the message was awaiting him. "Call at the police station in King Street, Brighton, and speak to a Mr. Mackintosh." An appropriate name for a police officer, Sidney thought, and the Mr. before his name implied a high rank indeed in the English system. Or at least it did in regard to doctors, Sidney knew. Sidney had to go from Liverpool to Victoria Station, which he did by bus and very slowly in traffic snarls, because he didn't care when he got to Brighton. As much chance of spotting Alicia in a restaurant at 8 p.m. as there was on the beach in mid-afternoon. But Sidney didn't think she was in Brighton proper, not with the police concentrating there. At Victoria, with a 45-minute wait until the next fast train, he telephoned Alex to see if there was any news about the whip. "What are you doing in London?" "I'm on my way to Brighton to join the search for Alicia," Sidney answered. "I'm calling to see if you heard anything from Plummer." "Yes, old chum. It came in this morning. They bought it." "Good. And the price?" £800 per story." Average. But I'm not complaining. I hope you're still working madly." "Madly? You haven't a few minutes to come by, have you?" "I'd rather not. I want to get going. What's on your mind?" "Well, this whole police business. You know, Sid, it's a wonder it went down so well at Granada." "What do you mean?" But as soon as Sidney asked, he knew. "Your name's on the script, too. What if you land in jail, old man?" "I'm not going to land in jail. After all, suspicion isn't jail," Sidney said defensively. "No, maybe not. But suppose it gets worse." "It's not going to get any worse. That's why I'm going to Brighton to spot my errant wife." "Oh, ring me from Brighton, would you? Call me collect if it's not convenient from where you are." "OK," Sidney said, without enthusiasm. Then his spirits rose at the thought of their sale. "We're set now, Alex. Have you told Hitty?" "Oh, yes." "Bye-bye, Alex." "Bye-bye." Of course, Alex had rung Hitty, but he hadn't rung him, though Sidney had been at home until nearly 11. Sidney suspected what was on Alex's mind. Alex was thinking that if he got into worse trouble, the whip could be stopped. Or the whip would belong entirely to Alex. Or was it true Alex was thinking that? Sidney frowned. Take it easy. Wait and see, he told himself. He walked slowly with his overnight bag toward platform 9, from which the Brighton train would depart. So this is what it felt like to be successful, to have made a big money sale, comparatively speaking. Alex was certainly chirping about it. Sidney felt awful. The city drew him as if by force of its own mass. and he turned around. Who else could he telephone? Carpi and Inez, of course. He had to get more pennies from a newsstand. It took a long time. Within 2 minutes he had arranged to go to Inez's and Carpi's. Inez was out. Sidney took a taxi, because their place was such a long way from any bus stop. Carpi, in sandals and a shapeless house dress, opened the door for him. "Welcome, Sidney. Come in and sit. It's the children's hour on the living room floor. You won't mind, will you?" "Oh, no," Sidney said pleasantly. 2 blankets were spread on the floor, reminding Sidney of the picnic, but now the babies were pushing plastic toys around instead of food. "Can I get you some coffee, Sid?" "Oh, no, thanks." "Sit down." He did, to get out of the way, sit down on the studio couch. "Or a sherry? That's all the house boasts just now." "Boasts? You should taste it yet." "Nothing, thanks. I won't stay more than 10 minutes," Sidney said, though he thought he'd nearly miss the next train anyway and have another hour's wait. Carpi sat down on a square hassock of yellow leather. "How long will you be in Brighton?" 2 or 3 days, I imagine. Enough to give it a good look. I think I can do a better job of looking than the police. "Tell me, about this digging. What's up?" Carpi chuckled throatily. The hassock sagged under her great weight. It was astounding that anyone could be so mature in a womanly way at 24, which was all she was. In fact, Carpi preferred to say she was a little older. "They dug for the carpet, which I buried pretty deeply," Sidney said, "and now they're wasting time digging for Alicia. As for Mrs. Lillybanks, she had an attack just as I was walking in her door Sunday evening to tell her there was nothing to worry about in the carpet, you see. The police had just found it, so I had official information." Sidney shrugged. He accepted the cigarette that Carpi offered. "Thanks." He took a deep pull on the cigarette. "I think I'll stay around Brighton over Friday and Saturday night. If Alicia's with a boyfriend, he might not get down till Friday or Saturday. I might not see them." He felt utterly depressed. Carpi looked a little stunned by all the information. She was watching Sidney carefully. "I liked Mrs. Lillybanks." "So did I." "You haven't heard a thing about Alicia? Not a hint from anywhere?" "Not a hint. In fact, the reason I came to see you is to ask you, again, if you have any ideas as to boyfriends." Carpi's full, lipstickless lips remained in solemn repose, closed. Her wide, dark eyes were fixed on Sidney's face. "Inez and I even talked about it. The answer is no, Sid. I'm sorry." "You see," Sidney got up, "I have the feeling, just a feeling, it's somebody she met here. We don't know so many people who give parties like the ones you give, not the Polk Faradays, for instance, not any of the people up in Suffolk. Sorry. That last party, when was it? In March?" Carpi thought, pressing a heavy hand against her temple. "Oh, Lordy. Around then, I remember. People standing up around the walls. I certainly didn't know anyone who was here. People brought people, you know." If any man at that party had struck up an acquaintance with Alicia, Sidney thought, he wouldn't likely have come back to Inez's and Carpi's even if invited. That was another handicap in naming him. Wait. Sidney stood up and faced the wall beside the door. "There was a fellow standing over here talking to Alicia that night. On the make, I remember. I was over here on the couch and never met him. Do you remember anybody, sort of well-dressed, brown hair? Not too tall, about 30? I can't remember the eyes. Very neat?" Carpi chuckled again. "Ought to. Neat and well-dressed. That doesn't turn up here too often." Sidney smiled. "Oh, I don't know. Could you ask Inez if she remembers anybody like that? Very Savile Row." "Sure, Sid. And I'll call you tonight, on the off chance she remembers." He picked up his bag. "I'll just make that train if I taxi to the station. Sorry to be rude, Carpi." "That's all right." She came with him to the door. "Best place for a taxi is turn left and left again." Sidney found a taxi quickly and made the train. Today was the first time he had been among the public in a long while, he realized, as he sat in a compartment with 5 other men. None of them stared at him. His picture had been in the papers only once, in early August, when the search for Alicia had begun. At Brighton, he stepped into a sunny, open world, where it looked as if nothing and no one could hide. Men wore sports shirts without ties. Women were in sandals and slacks or bright cotton skirts. Sidney walked down to the seafront. Utterly useless to look for her at 3:30 p.m. on the boardwalk, he supposed, yet the temptation to try the obvious places first was irresistible, and he visited 3 hotel lobbies briefly and walked back the way he had come, with his eyes on the beach and the boardwalk. He paid a 6 admission and went on to the Palace Pier. Here were hot dog stands, caramel popcorn, your photo in 3 minutes booths, mechanical fortune tellers, bingo parlours, and the noise of mingled jukeboxes. For another 6, one could rent a deck chair from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m, but Alicia was not sitting in any of them. Sidney went back to shore and asked the direction to police headquarters. Mr. Mackintosh was not on hand, but a pleasant man called Constable Clare spoke to him and explained, using a map of Brighton and the district, how they had been conducting the search. 2 weeks ago we covered all this, said Constable Clare, indicating a wide circle around Brighton, full of roads on which inns and hotels' names were written as well as towns. We even knocked on doors, and actually we're looking in a much wider area, all over England, you might say. Here they were joined by Mr. Mackintosh, a dark, slender man. I understand from the Ipswich office you want to join the search. His lips smiled at one corner. Yes, I do, for a few days, Sidney replied. I'd appreciate it if you'd check in here morning and evening to tell us what you might have discovered, or heard. A telephone call will do. Where will you be stopping in Brighton? No idea as yet. I might not even stay in Brighton. Would you mind giving us a ring tonight then, Mr. Bartleby, when you put yourself up? Sidney walked out into the sunlit street again. For what it was worth, he supposed he should be at the railway station at 7, and also at 8 this evening. He was, and it netted him nothing. Neither Alicia nor the elusive face of the dapper man Sidney was trying to recollect. He had a drink in 3 restaurants after that, at the height of the dinner hour. No luck either. Then he reclaimed his bag from the depository at the railway station, walked with it to the bus station, and took a bus to a tiny spot 10 miles away called Sumner Downs. It was as good a place as any, Sidney thought. He put himself up at an inn, where bed and breakfast was 26 shillings, and called Brighton Police Headquarters from a kiosk outdoors on the road so as not to be overheard by anyone in the inn. However, the name Bartleby hadn't aroused any interest in the woman proprietor. I'm sorry I don't know the name of the inn, Sidney said in answer to the police clerk's question, but it looks like the only one in town. In the next 2 days, Thursday and Friday, Sidney toured the countryside in buses which stopped everywhere. Bognor Regis on the west, Arundel, Lancing and Worthing, then Seaford and Peacehaven to the east of Brighton. Sometimes he got out and walked about, looking, and sometimes he asked questions at general stores and post offices. No one had heard of a blonde young woman, a summer guest, or of a young woman a little on the tall side and slender, whose hair was blonde, or reddish, or brown. Sidney couldn't imagine Alicia dyeing her hair black. But everyone asked, "What's her name?" And Sidney always said, "That doesn't matter, because I'm sure she'd be using a false name." 2 or 3 of the people he asked said, "They were looking for the Bartleby woman a couple of weeks back. We think she's dead, poor girl. It wouldn't be her you're looking for, would it?" "No," Sidney had answered. For what good would it have done to say yes? On Friday, August 19th, Sidney was back in Brighton in time for the 5 p.m. train. There were trains every half hour now. Hurrying businessmen poured off them, many with expectant smiles, many crashing happily into the arms of waiting girls. But no girl was Alicia, and no man was Dapper Dan. If the fellow was as well-heeled as he looked, Sidney thought, he might well drive down in a car. Sidney filled the intervals between trains with tea or a drink in the buffet of the station. At 7, back on the platform to watch the detraining passengers, Sidney saw a man who looked very much like the man he remembered. He was hatless, hurrying, with his head a little ducked, as if he didn't want to be seen. Anyway, Sidney gave chase. The man wasn't looking for anyone, that was plain from the way he kept his head down. He wore a grey business suit, neatly pressed, jacket open, carried a rolled umbrella, a black briefcase, and a bulging paper shopping bag from Sainsbury's. He looked for a taxi outside the station. Sidney did the same. The man got his, and Sidney managed to get one by being rude to a woman about 15 seconds later. "Just turn right here, first," Sidney said, sitting forward on his seat in order to keep the man's taxi in view. "Into town?" "I don't know yet." A moment later, Sidney said, "I'm with a friend in another taxi, the third up on the right. I've got to follow him." The driver was rather lost, but courteous, and Sidney promised to direct him as he watched the other taxi. They went down to the sea road and turned right. Like a jockey, Sidney urged his driver to pass a couple of cars so the man's taxi was in better view. Sidney sat up still more as the town thinned out. Suppose it wasn't the right taxi. Suppose the man were meeting a fat, dark-haired girl, or going to a house full of people where he was expected, a house where Alicia wasn't and where the people had never heard of Alicia. The man's taxi made a right turn, away from the sea, and slowed. "Not too close behind him, please." "Okay, drive on past," Sidney said, in a suddenly choking voice. Sidney had seen Alicia, standing at the left side of the road, beside a motor scooter, her hair short and auburn in the light of the setting sun, a summer skirt of blue billowing out. He looked left as he passed the two, who were so absorbed in each other, hands held, a kiss on the cheek and on the lips, they might not have known if a parade of lions was passing them. Sidney even heard a high note of Alicia's voice through the open window. "Those are my friends," Sidney said. "I want to surprise them later, so could you make a turn up here, turn around and go back?" The driver did so. The scooter was out of sight now, but there was a smaller road off to the right. Sidney asked the driver to take it. The scooter was in sight for a moment, then disappeared as it descended a hill. It was not going fast. The man was driving, Alicia was behind. The sea was on the left, and the road narrowed. Sidney did not want to be seen following them. "All right, turn around again if you will," Sidney said somewhat breathlessly. "I'd like to go back." "Go back?" "I'm early," Sidney said limply, not caring what he said. He had the driver go back to the station because he couldn't think of any other place to tell him to go to. After he had paid off the taxi, Sidney stood in a daze in the station, without direction or purpose, for a full half-minute. Alicia looked very happy. That was perhaps the most shocking thing of all. However, one had to be practical and efficient. Names, addresses, dates, and all that. Telephone numbers. He forced himself to remember Inez's and Carpy's. Then he got a lot of shillings from a 10-bob note and went to a telephone booth. Inez's voice came first, yelling over her shoulder to someone, and behind it the heavy rhythm of calypso music. "Hello," said Inez gaily. "Hello, Inez. Sidney here. How are you? Besides musical." "Me? Musical?" And she giggled as if someone were tickling her. "I wondered—" Sidney began and stopped. He couldn't tell them he had found Alicia and under what circumstances. "I saw Carpy Wednesday for a few minutes, you know. Asked her about a certain man I saw at one of your parties." "Oh, yes," said Inez, suddenly sobering. "Carpy. What was that man's name again?" "Oh, yeah, we thinks it might be Edward Tilbury, but don't quote us on that. He's a lawyer friend of Vasily's. You know Vasily from the picnic at your place?" Sidney remembered Vasily with the station wagon. "You think? Is he about 5'8", well-dressed, rolled umbrella type?" "He is, and I remember him too, a little, but I didn't know his name until we both sort of came up with it." Sidney could easily ask them to check on what Edward Tilbury was doing with his spare time lately, but he couldn't bring himself to. "Thanks a lot, Inez." "You're welcome, Sid, but I only think this is the guy you're talking about, and I don't know a thing about him seeing Alicia, naturally." "Sure, I understand, Inez. I'm very grateful. And don't worry, it's only an idea, on my part. She could be seeing anyone else, for that matter." "You think she's alive, Sid?" Inez said like a statement. "You don't think she's killed herself or anything?" "No, I don't." "Well, all this talk about you killing her makes you think somebody did because they're acting like she's dead." "Hogwash," said Sidney. Inez shrieked. "Hogwash? You telling me? I can just see you burying a carpet, you old nut with nothing in it. Ha ha ha!" Inez's good spirits picked Sidney up suddenly. "Inez, I sold the Whip series with Alex. Just heard a couple of days ago." "No kidding? Well, isn't that great? I'll spread the news, Sid. Funny Alex didn't tell us. Carpy called them last night for a wine party tomorrow. You back tomorrow night, Sid?" I don't think so. Thanks, Inez. That's too bad. What are you doing in Brighton? Just cruising the streets? More or less. Their conversation trickled off, and they hung up, with no further words about Edward Tilbury. Sidney patiently waited for a bus to Sumner Downs for 10 minutes, still in a kind of fog, then realised he had another 15 minutes to wait, and that he was supposed to ring Brighton Police Headquarters for his usual check-in. He went to a kiosk. "I'm still at Sumner Downs," he said, and almost said he'd be going back home tomorrow, but didn't. "Did you turn up anything today?" "Not a thing, sorry to say." 22. In his room in the inn at Sumner Downs, Sidney sank down tiredly in the one upholstered chair and reached in his pocket for the brown notebook. Not finding it, he pulled out his wallet in panicky haste and felt again. Not there. Hadn't he had it when he left Roncy Knoll? Still sitting in the chair, he looked around the room, but he knew it wasn't in the room because he hadn't made any notes since he had been here. Now the note he had been going to make danced in his head. "I have seen A, and feel on the brink of schizophrenia." And he had been going to elaborate on this. He could elaborate still further because of the missing notebook now. Had he ever had a notebook? Which half of him had it? Where was that half now? Where was the notebook? Sidney had changed into his best suit before leaving Roncy Knoll, but he had brought along his old tweed jacket. He leaped up and went to the wardrobe, felt in the old jacket, and found nothing. Could he have left the notebook absent-mindedly at home on the bed where he had spread his things when he packed? That was possible. Left it in some store. Today? He had broken £1 for cigarettes at a tobacconist's. His name wasn't in the notebook, and he wasn't worried now about any implication of guilt the notebook might give rise to. He was only sorry to have lost his jotted thoughts. He looked around for some paper, found none, and took from the drawer of the night table a rather soiled piece of tan wrapping paper on which he wrote his schizophrenic observation, which he continued. "Perhaps we are a quartet. Alicia a corpse, and I a murderer somewhere, and Alicia all sun-tanned down here, and I an anxious and cuckolded husband. The schizophrenic we would make a rather good title." Then he suddenly remembered that there was a name at the front of his notebook on a page by itself. Cliff Hanger. He had proposed it to Alex once as the name of their next television sleuth. Sidney smiled grimly and muttered, "God's teeth." He looked at the map he had bought of Brighton and the district. In the direction in which Alicia had been going lay Shoreham, Lancing, and Worthing, then Goring, Ferring, Angmering, Rustington, and Littlehampton. Hadn't Alicia once mentioned Angmering? Sidney had been to Lancing and Worthing. He supposed the thing to do was to go to them again and to the 4 towns beyond. He had a small bitters and a cheddar sandwich downstairs in the inn, went to bed, and slept badly. He got up at 7, and after shaving and dressing, went downstairs and asked for a London telephone directory. The inn had none. Sidney went to the kiosk outside, and from London information learned that there were several E. Tilburys, and that a middle initial would be helpful. Sidney asked them to ring the number of an Edward J. Tilbury in Maida Vale. There was no answer, though he had let it ring many times. He wished he had thought of ringing Tilbury last evening when he had been in Brighton and could have taken a look at all the E. Tilburys in a London book. A little after 10 a.m. Sidney got a bus that went in the direction of Worthing. He stayed on it until Angmering, where he got off. He had been here before, too. He remembered the Angmering post office, and also the thin, freckled man behind the window. Sidney walked on along the sea. There were 4 or 5 cottages in view, and Sidney looked them over for a scooter parked outside, for a glimpse of Alicia or of Tilbury at a window or outside the cottages, but without success. He wondered if they were cautious enough to take the scooter inside the house when they got it home. Sidney went into the post office. "Morning," he said to the man at the window. "Afternoon," replied the freckled man, smiling. "Yes. I'd like to ask if you know anyone around named Tilbury. Summer guests?" "Tilbury? No, but I'll take a look to make sure." He referred to a list that he pulled from a drawer and shook his head as he looked it over. "No Tilbury." "All right, thank you." Sidney felt suddenly tired and discouraged. You were asking about a girl before. That's her name? I'm not sure. He smiled a little, shrugged and went out. Then he came back. I wonder if you know any people with scooters, a grey one with a seat in the back. If you know a girl with short red hair who rides one. Oh, that sounds like Mrs. Lehman's. The freckled man frowned. Would you be looking for her? She lives nearby? Cottage down this way. He gestured toward the sea, the opposite of the Brighton direction. She's there with her husband. He comes down weekends. She's a summer visitor? New here? That's right. She's the Purple House, about 4 down the other side of the road. Thank you, Sidney said, and went out. Sidney looked once, a long minute, at the house the man probably meant, a pale lavender cottage of which Sidney could see only one back corner. He had no desire to go any closer. Mrs. Lehmans? Lehmans? A clever name, if it were Alicia and Tilbury. It didn't sound like a phony name, not as phony as Tilbury. It was 3 p.m. before Sidney got back to Sumner Downs and his inn, where he paid his bill and went upstairs to get his few belongings. Today's newspaper was under his arm, and on the night table lay the newspapers of the past 2 days. Mrs. Lillibank's inquest had been adjourned sine die, and the funeral had been Wednesday morning. The post-mortem had disclosed no poison or medical dose whatsoever, but her heart showed the dilation, or whatever it was, that had caused its failure, and this, in Dr. Thwaite's opinion, had been caused by a severe shock of some kind. And that would not have happened, Sidney thought, if Inspector Brockway had telephoned Mrs. Lillibanks just a few minutes before and told her there was nothing in the carpet. The Thursday paper also reported that Sidney Bartleby had gone to Brighton to assist the police in the search for his wife. No wonder Edward Tilbury had ducked his head on Friday evening. It was a wonder he had come at all. Downstairs, Sidney engaged the inn's taxi to take him to Brighton. With the whip money coming, he felt he could afford the guinea it cost. He called in at the police station. Mr. Mackintosh was there. Sidney told him he had had no luck and that he was going back to Suffolk. "Would you sign something for us before you go, Mr. Bartleby?" Mr. Mackintosh gave him a sheet of paper on which he had to fill in several blanks, his hour of arrival in Brighton and hour of departure. The paper stated that he had come with the purpose of assisting the police in their search for his wife, Alicia, and below this he was to write in his results. Sidney wrote, "No success." In the Brighton station he looked at a London directory and thought that an Edward S. Tilbury in Sloane Street looked the most promising. There were only 4 E-something Tilburys after all. Sidney got some change and risked a call. No answer from Tilbury in Sloane Street. He could stand outside the house in Sloane Street Sunday night and Monday morning to see if Dapper Dan came in, Sidney thought, but he balked at such snooping. He could also ask Inez and Carpy to find out where their Edward Tilbury lived, if he could swallow his pride. That jerky, muck-faced square. Alicia had fallen for that. Sidney had 20 minutes before his train, so he rang Alex on the off chance he might be there, though Sidney expected that he had gone to Clacton by now. Alex answered. "I'm arriving in London at 5, and I wonder if I can see you for a few minutes," Sidney said. "Ugh, I was going to catch a 6 o'clock train, old pal. Can't you take a later one? Did you hear anything about Alicia?" "Not a thing, I'm sorry to say. Alex, I'll get there as soon as I can. We've just sold the whip, and after all—" Sidney checked himself, realizing he was pleading. "What about contracts, for instance?" "It's here." Sidney said he was coming and put the telephone down before Alex could start protesting. He dozed on the train up to London, though it was the last thing he had thought he would be able to do. Just before Victoria, he splashed non-potable water on his face in the lavatory and combed his hair. Then he took a taxi to the Polk Faraday's flat in Notting Hill. It was the first floor of a white house. Sidney half expected no answer when he rang the bell, but Alex came down the stairs to open the door. "Hi," said Alex. "Hello. I won't keep you long. It's only 5:20 and you might even make the 6 o'clock. Alex showed no interest in the time, and Sidney suddenly felt he had been faking the 6 o'clock train. They climbed the stairs. "Do they want any changes in the first script?" Sidney asked. "Quite a few little things, but I'll do those." "Changes in the plot?" "No." Alex opened the door of his flat, which led immediately into a large and now quite untidy living room that gave on the street. A suitcase lay open on the sofa, only half filled. Their main closet was in the living room, a great white wardrobe in the corner. There was a hobby horse and a soiled, buff-coloured giraffe on its side on the floor. "Let's see the contract," Sidney said. Alex got it from the pocket in the lid of his suitcase. "I haven't signed it yet." Sidney read through its 3 sheets. The contract gave a 50-50 split. The series was to run for a minimum of 6 weeks, with a proviso for extension and increased payment in case of extension. "It looks all right, doesn't it?" Sidney asked. "Nothing great, but they're not cheating us anywhere." "No," said Alex in a troubled way. "What's the trouble?" "The trouble—" Alex fumbled with something in his suitcase, then straightened. "The trouble, Sid, is the trouble you're in." "Oh, come off it. Alicia's hale and hearty. Probably got a boyfriend. I'm sick of it." Alex studied him and took a step back, around the foot of the sofa. Sidney realized he had walked a step toward Alex. He wondered if Alex were pretending to be afraid of him. "What's on your mind, Alex?" "What's on my mind is the series could be stopped if this thing gets any worse." Sidney felt suddenly angry. He was angry because he thought Alex was faking. "Maybe what's on your mind is you'd like to have the series all to yourself, especially as the first 6 stories are already invented and on paper, already accepted, from the plumber story down to Paddington." "Don't be mad! Want the series for myself?" Alex gave a laugh. "But Sid, there is a problem and you know it. Where's Alicia? It's all very well to say she's alive and got a boyfriend, but where is she? Do you think the public's going to look at your name coming across the screen every week with mine without thinking about this or doing something about it?" "Doing something about it?" "Boycotting us, writing in complaints." Sidney smiled. "Enjoyed the play, but I object to the author." "Ha! Don't you know they can cut us off in midstream?" "Don't be vulgar, Alex. Don't be funny. Do you see any reason why I should run that risk? Just for you?" Sidney frowned. "So what do you propose?" "I think I ought to get 60% and you 40. I think that's only fair, considering the work I've put in and will put in, considering it could be cut off any minute." Sidney sighed. He remembered Alex's appetite for money, instilled in him by his family, who prodded him constantly lest he forget. "I'm running the same risk. I've put time in on it too." "But your work is finished, and you caused the risk. Without me, you wouldn't have any of it." "Oh, hell, Alex. I'm sick of the argument, and I don't agree to your terms." Alex gave a tight smile and walked to the coffee table for a cigarette. "You're free now, relatively speaking, but how long do you think it's going to last? What if the police knew what Hitty and I know, Sid, about your bumbling mistakes when you were trying to tell us where Alicia was? You couldn't even remember the story you intended to stick to. All those that she was with her mother. That's what she told me to tell people. All those jokes, after you'd had a few drinks, about putting her 6 feet under and living on her income. All those fights you had with her, when we were there." "I don't need a few drinks to make up stories like those. I can make up stories like those any time." "How do I know they were stories? Suppose they're true." Now Sidney was merely irritated. Whether Alex was being stupid or trying blackmail with a heavy hand, Sidney was bored. "All right, Alex. Do you believe they're true?" "I don't know," Alex replied. Sidney watched him. Was he lying? "Get to the point. Do you, or do you just want a bigger cut?" "Sid, I don't know what's going to happen." "Did you kill Alicia?" He looked like an emoting character in one of his own plays, Sidney thought. "No, dear," said Sidney. "Are you trying to blackmail me?" "I don't call it blackmail. I simply—" "You probably don't. Blackmail's a plain word. It's very clear what it means, and you don't seem to care to be clear." Sidney again took a step toward Alex without thinking, and Alex again retreated. "Are you afraid of me? Have you convinced yourself that I kill people? Since you put it in the plural, we shouldn't forget Mrs. Lilybanks. The doctor wouldn't give a certificate of natural death. What sort of conclusion do you think people will draw? That you scared her to death, of course, maybe deliberately. If the police were drawing that conclusion, I'd be arrested. Come off it, Alex. If you don't like the word blackmail, let's call it greed. It's greed you're showing now. Sidney took one of Alex's cigarettes from the package on the coffee table. "Thanks," he said, lifting the cigarette. Alex was checked for a moment, but not defeated. He came back to the attack with a new will. "I'm holding out for 60%, Sid, for my own security. Take it or else, and you know what the else is." "No, I don't." "I can tell the police a great deal that isn't nice, and a great deal of what went on before Alicia disappeared. Those nasty quarrels you used to have." "Oh, throwing a teacup?" Sidney laughed. "If you believe what you're saying, you should say these things anyway. To the police." "I don't really know what to believe," Alex said, "and I'm trying to protect my interests. It's as simple as that." His logic reminded Sidney of some of Alicia's, but Alicia's was always naive, and Alex's was full of self-interest. But Sidney could see that Alex was sincere. Alex had simply blinded himself, like a squid behind its own ink. "You're in no position to laugh." Alex walked toward his suitcase. "I'm tired of arguing too, and I'm going to take off." "Not waiting for my answer?" "My answer is that I don't accept." "That's not at all wise of you," Alex said. "I'll give you till Monday to make up your mind. By Monday you might be in custody anyway, but if you're not, my address is Clacton-on-Sea, the Sea Winds Hotel." "My love to Hitty," Sidney said, then crossed the living room with his overnight bag and went out the door. On the train to Ipswich, Sidney had planned to think, to decide what to do. But as soon as he tried, his problems seemed like one huge mountain hurled at his brain, and he collapsed under its weight, figuratively speaking. His brain was benumbed and sought escape in sleep. He recovered his car in Ipswich and drove home in the gathering darkness. 23. On Saturday, August 20th, Alicia and Edward were relieved to see a tiny item in the Evening Argus saying that Sidney Bartleby had left Brighton after a search for his missing wife, which had netted him nothing. By now they were in Lancing, where, still as Mr. and Mrs. Eric Lehmans, they had rented very cheaply a house much too big for them. The house was called a villa. Since the death of Mrs. Lillybanks, Edward was more than ever for stopping the game, since he thought it cast an unfair suspicion upon Sidney in regard to Alicia. Edward wanted to go quietly back to London and stay there, and wanted Alicia to go quietly to her parents' home and announce herself, but Alicia couldn't face admitting to her family and to Sidney that she had been living with a man for more than a month under another name. It was Edward's idea to marry her once she got divorced in an ordinary manner, and Alicia wanted this too. But each day, for all her efforts to think and act, bogged her deeper in guilt and embarrassment, as if the whole situation were a quagmire. She had said many times to Edward in the earlier part of their liaison, and when Mrs. Lillybanks had rather mysteriously died, "Sid's not really right in the head, Edward. I've known it for a long while. Look at the way he acted with Mrs. Lillybanks. Acted is the word. That carpet performance. And then his nervousness about the binoculars, the papers said. He doesn't know what's truth or fiction any longer. Then it's time you acted, darling, before he gets himself in any deeper. They can't arrest you for what you've done. You're not the first woman to have an affair extramaritally." Edward's words, meant to be bracing, only made Alicia feel more frightened and cowardly. "I can never face him now," she said flatly. "He'll kill me on sight, or at very least think I'm a ghost. He's lost his mind, Edward. I certainly can't face him the way things are now." "I don't think he's lost his mind," Edward murmured nervously. "I think he's somehow waiting for you to come back." "Why do you think that?" Edward didn't know, but he felt he had a glimmer of what Sidney was all about. He could hardly have put it into words. It was quite in character for Sidney to come down to Brighton and spend 4 days looking for Alicia and not find her. "I can't imagine," Edward said, and not for the first time, "that if he really roamed around in this area, he didn't see one of us at some point, in the street or in some shop." Alicia was silent for a moment, afraid that Sidney might have seen her and done nothing about it. That would have been like him. Rather mad. "It wouldn't have mattered if he'd seen you. He wouldn't have remembered you from that party that night, I know." Then Edward would be silent, They had had this conversation 3 times, because he was not so sure Sidney didn't know about him and Alicia, while if he told Alicia this, she'd lose her last shred of courage and say goodbye to him forever in a chaos of shattered pride. Vasily had said something to Edward about Inez and Carpi, asking what he had been doing lately. Vasily had repeated to them Edward's answer that he had been visiting friends in Surrey quite a bit. Good old Vasily. Vasily could be trusted to keep his white Russian discretion, even if he suspected the truth, but Edward had the feeling Sidney would quiz Inez and Carpi and get them to make inquiries for him, and that therefore Inez and Carpi might know the truth now too. And they might tell it, Edward thought. Departures from London were increasingly torturous to Edward. He felt he was definitely being spied upon when he set foot on the Brighton platform, spied upon as he pressed the first kiss on Alicia's cheek, if she were there to meet him. It was making him horribly nervous, and he had to take a sleeping pill almost every night in London. And he felt that an axe was due to fall, if he didn't get back to his customary, respectable bachelor's routine in London, where he spent his weekends reading and playing music, and perhaps going to a little dinner party, to which he usually escorted no one on Saturday evenings. That was the kind of life Alicia said she wanted too. "We'll never budge from where we are now if you don't make a move, darling," Edward said to her. "You've got to get in touch with Sidney eventually, if only to get your divorce." Alicia only looked into space and bit her lower lip. Why did things have to be like this, in such a god-awful muddle? Well, mainly because of Sidney. If he hadn't stupidly, asininely buried the carpet, and probably asininely, like a clown, pretended to be nervous and guilty when their friends or the police asked him where she was, she and Edward wouldn't be in the position they were in. She'd just have gone away for a few months, as she had told Sidney she was going to do, and as he agreed to let her do. She could have seen Edward, enjoyed his company for a while, and quietly come back and told Sidney she wanted to divorce him. Now she had a faint desire to get back at Sidney, to let him sink as deeply into a mess as he wished to, and perhaps more deeply. "I think, too," she said to Edward, "it's very likely Sidney saw me somewhere, even though I was being careful those days, naturally. But I had to do a little shopping for us. Anyway, you said you didn't see him at the station on Friday." "I wasn't looking around, naturally. That only attracts attention. He might have seen me." Edward was sitting on the shabby straw chaise longue on their terrace, putting white on his shoes. "Well, if he saw me, he can say he saw me, can't he? What's stopping him? It's not as if I were contributing to getting him blamed for murder." Now she sounded more sure of herself, but her logic was faulty. "No, dear, if we know he saw you, but we're not sure of that. It's no good saying there's a 50-50 chance he did, or more than likely he did. How do we know? I'm bound to say it's more logical to assume he didn't see you, and therefore can't save himself by saying he did." Edward left this on an expectant note, and Alicia looked at him. Her eyes filled with nervous tears. "I know what you're going to say, that I ought to go back and face things. Well, I can't. I'd really rather kill myself." "Nonsense," Edward said in a solid tone. "But look, darling, whether you like Sidney or not, whether he's treated you well or ill, he's going to lose even his professional standing if this goes on." "Professional standing? A silly television series?" Edward had heard through Vasily, who had heard through Inez and Carpi, that Sidney had sold the whip. "You told me he wrote books." Alicia was not thinking about Sidney. She gazed miserably across the room at her best painting, the best and biggest she had ever done in her life. 6 by 8 feet, an abstract of sea and flowers. With Edward, she could paint. Somehow his solidity, his very conservatism, brought out her imagination more than Sidney's kinkiness ever had. She knew the kind of life Edward led, knew the kind of friends he had, the kind of house he kept, with good antique furniture in it, and a daily who kept things waxed and dusted. She hadn't seen his flat, but she could imagine it. That was the kind of life she wanted, the kind she had been brought up to lead, after all, just as her mother said. Now, because of Sidney's antics, that lovely future with Edward was spoiled, could never start smoothly, if it ever started at all. What excuse could she make for herself? That was the main thing. That she had been afraid of Sidney? That was the only halfway honourable out. What she most of all dreaded was that the police would insist on knowing where and how she had hidden herself away for 2 months, under what names and with whom. Her parents would never forgive her, and it would ruin Edward's career.
"I can't go back, Edward," Alicia said, and put her face down in her hands on her lap. "I can't face it."